Okay, this issue has just been flying into my face so often this year that it's just been begging for a thorough rant. So, you know that thing that fundamentalists do when they tell you that you haven't studied enough about the cultural context and the original language of their holy book to have a valid opinion on it? Yeah, I'm gonna make a video about that. You've probably had this experience sometimes when you're talking to really devout believers about the contents of their holy book and you point out some cruel, inaccurate, or just frickin' absurd thing about their holy book or stories. They will respond with some answer that basically amounts to, "You haven't studied the cultural, linguistic, and historical context of that story. Your opinion cannot possibly be valid because you haven't studied theology and hermeneutics and the various commentaries related to this passage enough to truly have an informed opinion." It's a very dismissive argument, and it's not only logically fallacious, but it also assumes a lot about the anti-theist and anti-religion movements. Namely, that its members could have never been devout believers in the doctrines that they're now criticizing, or that they never actually looked into the historical situation from which these texts emerged, or most amusingly, that they never thought about these apologetics arguments before. But even moving beyond that, there is something even more fundamentally problematic. When critics of, for example, the Abrahamic monotheisms confront Jews, Christians, and Muslims with this cruel and absurd passages in their sacred text, they sometimes respond, "You need to study the original language and cultural context more." Do they not understand how foolish this makes their particular God look? Are these gods not smart enough to look into the future and see that these languages and cultures they transmit their perfect messages into would change and die out, and that through the passing of time these dictations would inevitably be changed, misinterpreted, and become less relevant? And that people centuries down the line that they want to communicate with would need all of these complicated apologetics arguments and academic theological tools to decipher some of the bizarre and sometimes immoral activities that they either commit or sanction? But even more to the point, when believers argue that entire sections of their sacred texts are not meant to be applied to our society today, for example, the epistles teaching that Christian women should not speak in church and cover their heads while praying, do they not see how fundamentally they undermine the ability of their scriptures to act as a solid foundation for people trying to live their lives in the 21st century? Seriously, if we're saying that these passages were written to specific churches in specific times in specific cities, as is the case with most of the epistles supposedly written by St. Paul, and don't directly apply to us today, how exactly do we determine which instructions, which apostolic instructions, do apply today, and which ones we can disregard? I found the same thing to be true with the Quran. I had an occasion once where I was discussing the Quran with a Muslim, and I pointed out a certain passage in Surah 4 where it basically states that a man is allowed to strike his wife if she continues in disobedience after a certain amount of warning. This Muslim street preacher informed me that it was just a light tap, and that the language of the time made it very clear that it wasn't as severe as the forms of domestic abuse that we think of today. Same thing with the so-called sword passages. Muslim apologists will sometimes argue that these instructions about jihad were to the Prophet and his followers, and were for a specific time and place. Well, how do we determine what to apply today and what to disregard? Perhaps the most dishonest thing about this form of argumentation is the way in which deep study and critical thinking and exhaustive research are not required or even encouraged when it comes to getting children to accept the beliefs that they are being taught in Sunday school, or children's church, or Bible camp, or whatever. Among many fundamentalists, it is seen as appropriate to indoctrinate young children with these texts long before they have access to concordances or various interpretations of the story, or even before their minds have fully developed and they are capable of thinking about the doctrines and texts critically. I speak with some guilt here because I was one of the helpers in what's called a Good News Club my junior and senior years in high school. Basically, we taught Bible lessons to 5 and 6 year olds and encouraged them to basically memorize verses, and we rewarded their enthusiasm with snacks and treats. That probably could and should be the subject of a future video, but I want to underline a point here. Never in the entire time that I was helping with that club did we ever concern ourselves with whether the children understood the cultural, historic, and linguistic context of the Bible stories or not. We just presented the stories at face value, presented them with what we thought were the moral lessons, and counted on them to have the childlike faith that is taught about in the Bible. Yet when someone like a person like who I am right now reads these Bible stories and rejects them at face value, we are sometimes told that we have not studied it enough and investigated its background. And lastly, there's just so much hypocrisy and special pleading in this form of argumentation. The fact is that often when you find a believer that tells you to go study the context and history and linguistic background of their faith, that believer will rarely, if ever, seem willing to grant the same leniency to other faiths. When I was going through my deconversion process back in 2009, I remember very clearly a very emotional conversation I had with a member of my family. This person told me that what I needed to do was get a Bible concordance and really study the Hebrew and the Greek and the Aramaic language that the Bible authors use to truly get a deep understanding of the Word of God. A thought occurred to me then, and it still occurs to me to this day. Why is it that these people never feel the need to have a deep knowledge of, let's say, 7th century Arabic culture and language before deciding that they are not Muslims and do not believe that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet? Why do they not feel the need to verse themselves completely in ancient Indian culture and language before deciding that they do not believe that the god Vishnu descended down to the mortal plane into the avatar of Krishna, who gave the quote-unquote absolute truth of the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna before his great heart-wrenching battle with his loved ones? It's such a special pleading mess where it's like, oh, those religions, you can just not believe in them, but my religion, you have to become an expert before you dismiss it. Ha! Please tell me some of you share my frustration. I'd love to hear back from you all. Anyone else deal with this kind of discussion before? How did you respond to them? Let me know. Answer the questions by questioning the answers. Later.